The silver watch struck the marble floor at exactly 9:17, and although the orchestra never missed a note, Ethan Caldwell heard the sound above every conversation in the Hawthorne Hotel ballroom. A server in white gloves dropped to one knee beside the spinning watch, but Ethan reached it first, because the scratched initials on its back belonged to the father who had died without explaining where it had disappeared 20 years earlier. The young woman extended her hand without apology or awe, as though billionaires knelt at her feet every evening, and Ethan noticed that she was watching his face more carefully than the watch itself. When he asked where she had found it, she answered that it had belonged to her mother, then added a sentence that made the air between them feel suddenly colder. She told me never to give it to a Caldwell unless he asked why it stopped at 9:17. Before Ethan could question her, the catering director called her name from across the ballroom, and Amara Brooks disappeared behind a curtain reserved for hotel staff. Ethan remained on the floor with the watch in his hand, staring at the frozen minute hand and wondering why his father had preserved the exact time of a secret no one in the family had ever admitted existed. For the rest of the gala, Ethan moved through donors, senators, and investors with the practiced restraint that had made him one of the most respected executives in New York. Yet every polished exchange felt unreal beside that unfinished sentence. His father, Benjamin Caldwell, had carried the watch daily until returning from a summer trip through Pennsylvania, withdrawn, suspicious, and unwilling to discuss the 3 days missing from his itinerary. The official family account blamed exhaustion and a minor automobile accident, but Ethan remembered the locked study, the arguments behind closed doors, and the way Benjamin flinched whenever his cousin Richard entered the room. Those memories had faded beneath decades of corporate responsibility, although the stopped watch brought each one back with uncomfortable precision. Ethan found his chief of staff, Daniel Harper, near the auction stage, and instructed him to identify Amara without contacting investigators, reporters, or anyone connected to the Caldwell family. Daniel raised one careful question about whether the young woman might be seeking money, but Ethan looked toward the curtain where she had vanished and said she had already possessed the most valuable object in the room. If money had been her motive, she would not have carried the watch on a serving tray wrapped beneath a folded linen napkin. Several floors below, Amara changed out of her uniform while two co-workers whispered about the billionaire who had followed her with his eyes. She pretended not to hear them, although her hands shook as she fastened the worn watch around her wrist and pulled her sleeve over it. Her mother had made her memorize 3 rules before dying: never sell the watch, never open its back, and never trust a Caldwell who asked what it was worth before asking why it had stopped. Ethan had passed the first test, but Amara understood that wealthy men often sounded sincere when curiosity protected their own interests. She checked the balance in her banking application, calculated the cost of Marcus's Monday rehabilitation appointment, and forced herself to remember that old family secrets did not pay present bills. Yet when she left through the service entrance, a dark sedan waited beneath the hotel awning, with its engine running and no license plate visible from where she stood. The vehicle pulled away only after she crossed the street, which left her unsure whether someone had been waiting for Ethan, for the watch, or for her. Marcus was awake when Amara reached their Harlem apartment, seated at the kitchen table with resistance bands looped around his knees and a stack of unpaid medical statements beside his coffee. He was 26, younger than Amara by 4 years, although the spinal injury from a construction accident had made him patient in ways their mother never lived long enough to see. When Amara placed the watch on the table, he stopped exercising and asked whether Ethan Caldwell had recognized it. She admitted he had, then described the sedan and the way it left after watching her cross the street. Marcus wanted her to contact the police, but both siblings knew they had no crime to report, only a feeling shaped by a family history, built from warnings instead of explanations. On the wall behind him hung the last photograph their mother, Evelyn Brooks, had kept from the summer of 1998, showing her beneath a stone church arch beside a man whose face had been cut cleanly from the print. Amara had always assumed the missing figure was someone Evelyn once loved. Yet tonight, she noticed the edge of a dark suit and a silver chain disappearing beneath the torn border. Across Manhattan, Ethan entered his father's private study for the first time in nearly 3 years. carrying the watch inside a handkerchief, as though it might accuse him of carelessness. The room remained exactly as Benjamin had left it, with legal books arranged by year, old correspondence sealed inside cedar boxes, and a mahogany desk whose bottom drawer had resisted every key in the estate. Ethan placed the watch beneath the desk lamp and turned the crown, but the hands remained frozen at 9:17, while a faint scrape beneath the casing suggested someone had once opened it with a tool. Inside the nearest cedar box, he found travel receipts from the Pennsylvania trip, although one hotel invoice had been replaced by an empty envelope bearing the words, "For Ethan, when the watch returns." The envelope contained no letter, only a brass rubbing of an oak leaf and a handwritten address in the town of Bellwether, Pennsylvania. Before Ethan could call Daniel, the study lights flickered, the security alarm briefly failed, and footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond the locked door. Ethan extinguished the desk lamp and moved silently behind the bookcase, resisting the instinct to announce himself inside a house guarded by men who should already know every visitor. The door handle turned once, paused, and turned again before a figure stepped into the darkened study using an original Caldwell family key. Ethan waited until the intruder crossed toward the desk, then switched on the wall lights and found Richard Caldwell standing beside the chair with an expression that shifted too quickly from surprise to concern. Richard claimed he had seen the study lights from the driveway and entered because recent electrical problems worried him, although Ethan knew his cousin had not visited the estate without an appointment in months. When Ethan asked why he carried Benjamin's master key, Richard smiled with the weary patience of an older relative correcting a suspicious child. He said Benjamin had given it to him decades earlier, before trust became a word younger men used only when they wanted something. Richard left after reminding Ethan that reopening private family history could damage living people more severely than it honored the dead, which sounded less like advice after Ethan discovered the empty envelope missing from the desk. By sunrise, Daniel had gathered employment records from the catering company and confirmed that Amara had worked luxury events for 7 years without complaints, lawsuits, unexplained income, or contact with journalists. More troubling was the surveillance footage outside the Hawthorne, which showed the dark sedan arriving 20 minutes before the watch fell and leaving after Amara crossed the street. The vehicle belonged to a private security contractor, retained by an investment group whose directors included Richard Caldwell's attorney. Daniel cautioned that the connection did not prove Richard had ordered anyone to follow Amara, yet Ethan heard the same warning his father had hidden inside the phrase about the returning watch. They drove to Bellwether without notifying the estate staff, following the handwritten address to a weathered stone church surrounded by sycamore trees and boarded storefronts. The building now served as a community pantry, where an elderly pastor named Samuel Green recognized Benjamin's photograph before Ethan finished explaining why they had come. Samuel did not welcome them warmly because he remembered the Caldwell name arriving twice in that town, first with a frightened man during a flood, and later with lawyers who offered money for everyone's silence. Samuel described the night Benjamin entered the church soaked through, carrying a leather case and insisting that someone from his own company had forced his car from the road. Evelyn, then a 29-year-old volunteer nurse, treated the cut above his eye while floodwater trapped travelers inside until morning. Benjamin refused to contact his family, claiming their telephone lines could not be trusted, and he asked Evelyn to protect the pocket watch because the casing contained something more important than the family crest. Samuel never learned what was hidden inside, but he remembered Benjamin stopping the hands at 9:17 before wrapping the watch in a handkerchief. That was the exact moment a telephone call reached the church office from a man claiming to be Benjamin's cousin, although Benjamin had told no one where he was. Evelyn listened from the doorway while Benjamin denied being present, then promised she would keep the watch until he returned personally. He never returned, and 3 months later, 2 men offered the church enough money to rebuild its entire roof in exchange for the watch and every record from that night. Amara spent the same morning at Marcus's rehabilitation clinic, where the therapist explained that insurance would no longer cover the treatment schedule responsible for his recent progress. Marcus tried to make light of the news, But Amara understood that reducing therapy now could undo months of painful work. When she returned home, an envelope lay beneath the apartment door, containing no message, only a photograph of her leaving the hawthorn beside the handwritten words, "Your mother made one mistake. Do not repeat it." Amara called Ethan before fear could persuade her to hide the warning, and he answered from the Bellwether Church while Samuel stood several feet away. She told him about the photograph, then demanded to know whether he had sent anyone to follow her. Ethan's denial sounded immediate rather than polished, but Amara refused to accept trust as a substitute for proof. She agreed to meet him only after he promised to bring every document he had found and to answer questions without lawyers present. They met that evening inside a crowded diner near Columbia University, choosing a public place where privacy would be difficult, but disappearance nearly impossible. Ethan showed Amara the address, the oak leaf rubbing, and the surveillance image connecting the sedan to Richard's attorney, while Amara placed the threatening photograph between them. She revealed that Evelyn had kept a carved wooden box bearing the same oak leaf pattern, although the box had no visible hinges and no keyhole. Ethan admitted that an identical carving appeared beneath the locked drawer in Benjamin's study, which meant their parents had divided something neither family could uncover alone. Marcus, who had insisted on joining them, listened until Ethan mentioned the time 9:17, then removed an old cassette from his backpack. Evelyn had recorded bedtime stories for her children during her final illness, and at the end of one tape, after several minutes of silence, her voice returned unexpectedly. Marcus had discovered the passage only that afternoon, and when he pressed play, Evelyn whispered that if Benjamin's son ever came searching, they must ask him who profited when Benjamin stopped speaking. The recording ended with a sound like wood striking metal, followed by a man's voice too faint to identify, saying that the board would believe grief before it believed fraud. Ethan felt the diner narrow around him, because Benjamin's withdrawal after Pennsylvania had allowed Richard to assume control over several divisions before Ethan was old enough to understand corporate power. Daniel called before anyone could replay the tape, reporting that the Caldwell board had scheduled an emergency review of Ethan's leadership after receiving anonymous allegations that he was using company resources to pursue a personal relationship with an employee. Attached to the complaint were photographs of Ethan entering the diner with Amara and Marcus, taken less than 10 minutes earlier. Someone was not merely following them from the past. Someone was watching the table where they were sitting, and Ethan realized the safest place in Manhattan had already become another room controlled by his family. Ethan did not look toward the windows, because whoever photographed them would be waiting for the natural reaction of a frightened man confirming he had discovered the threat. Instead, he asked the waitress for another pot of coffee, paid the bill in cash, and instructed Daniel to send 2 trusted drivers through separate entrances without alerting Caldwell security. Amara resented being directed, yet she recognized the difference between control and urgency when Ethan quietly handed Marcus the only vehicle key and told him to choose their route. They left through the kitchen, while a delivery truck blocked the rear alley, then separated from Daniel before reaching Broadway, forcing any observer to decide which car carried the watch. During the drive, Marcus admitted he had moved Evelyn's wooden box from their apartment weeks earlier because the landlord planned repairs and too many workers possessed keys. The box was stored inside a locker at the community center, where Evelyn had volunteered, under the name she used before marrying their father, a detail no Caldwell investigator should know. When they arrived, however, the locker door stood open, and the shelf contained only a folded blue cloth shaped around the empty space where the box had rested. Amara blamed herself before anyone else could speak, because she had once listed the community center as an emergency contact on Marcus's clinic forms. Ethan rejected the apology and examined the lock, which showed no forced entry, suggesting whoever opened it had obtained a duplicate key or persuaded an employee to cooperate. The center director reviewed camera footage and found a maintenance worker entering the storage hall 40 minutes earlier, although no maintenance visit had been scheduled. Daniel identified the man as an employee of the same security contractor connected to Richard's attorney, creating evidence strong enough for police involvement, but not enough to prove who issued the order. Amara wanted the theft reported immediately, while Ethan feared a formal complaint would alert the person searching for the box before they understood what it contained. Their disagreement exposed the first real difference between them. Ethan had spent his life controlling information until he could use it safely, whereas Amara had survived by creating records powerful people could not quietly erase. Marcus ended the argument by reminding them that Evelyn had never trusted silence itself. She had trusted the right person to speak at the right time. The blue cloth left behind carried a faint impression from the box's carved base, including a circular mark neither Amara nor Marcus had noticed before. Ethan photographed the pattern and sent it to Samuel Green, who recognized it as the seal of a cabinet maker named Thomas Vale, a bellwether craftsman who had built hidden compartment furniture for local churches and historical societies. Thomas had died years earlier, although his daughter still operated the workshop outside town and kept every design ledger he created. Before returning to Pennsylvania, Ethan attended the emergency board review, refusing Richard's private offer to postpone the meeting if Ethan agreed to end contact with Amara. Richard framed the proposal as protection, claiming the press would turn a struggling black woman into a symbol and destroy her privacy to embarrass a billionaire. Ethan recognized the manipulation because it carried enough truth to resemble compassion. He declined, then entered the boardroom and acknowledged that he was investigating a personal matter connected to Benjamin's history, but he denied using company money or personnel beyond Daniel's voluntary assistance. Richard produced hotel photographs showing Ethan watching Amara during the gala, then suggested his obsession had already affected business judgment. Several directors appeared uncomfortable rather than convinced, until Amara entered with Marcus and placed the threatening photograph on the table. She stated her name, occupation, and relationship to Evelyn without performing either gratitude or fear, then explained that someone linked to a Caldwell contractor had followed her, threatened her, and stolen property connected to Benjamin. Richard asked whether Ethan had promised financial assistance for Marcus's treatment, hoping to imply that Amara had exchanged accusations for personal benefit. Amara answered that Ethan had offered nothing, and she would reject any payment made before the truth was established. Her restraint shifted the room more effectively than anger could have, although Richard remained composed and requested an independent investigation designed to remove Ethan temporarily from leadership. The motion failed by one vote, but a second motion passed, requiring Ethan to produce verifiable evidence within 72 hours, or face suspension. They drove to Bellwether that afternoon, where Thomas Vale's daughter, Clara, welcomed them into a workshop smelling of cedar, machine oil, and rain. She found two matching entries from 1998, one oak box commissioned by Evelyn Brooks, and another built for Benjamin Caldwell, both designed to open only when aligned beneath a specific brass mechanism. Thomas's notes stated that the first box contained the guide, while the second contained the witness, although no drawing explained what those words meant. Clara also revealed that a third commission had been canceled after a Caldwell representative demanded copies of the internal plans. Her father refused, then hid the original ledger after someone broke into the workshop. When Ethan showed her Richard's photograph, Clara identified him as the younger man who had accompanied the representative, not as a distant relative mentioned years later, but as the person who personally threatened to close every charitable account in Bellwether unless Thomas surrendered the designs. The stolen box suddenly mattered for more than sentiment, yet Clara provided one advantage their pursuer had overlooked. Thomas created every matched pair with a false bottom, accessible only after the boxes were placed together, which meant stealing Evelyn's box alone revealed nothing. Benjamin's matching box still had to exist somewhere inside the Caldwell estate, most likely behind the locked drawer carved with the same oak leaves. Ethan called Daniel and ordered the study sealed before anyone else could enter, but Daniel did not answer. A message arrived seconds later from Daniel's telephone containing a photograph of the open study. The mahogany desk pulled away from the wall, and Daniel unconscious on the carpet beside the missing bottom drawer. Beneath the image, someone had written a single sentence: "Bring the watch to the old church by 9:17, or the man who served your father will die with his secret." Amara read the message twice before Ethan took the telephone from her hand, not because she lacked courage, but because the demand was designed to make urgency replace judgment. The photograph showed Daniel's wristwatch, a broken lamp, and blood near his temple. Yet the shadows beneath the desk suggested the image had been taken before sunset, despite arriving after dark. Marcus enlarged the window reflection and noticed a clock in the opposite hallway displaying 6:42, which meant their captor had held the photograph for nearly 2 hours while waiting to see what they discovered in Bellwether. Ethan wanted to drive directly to the church, but Amara insisted they contact Samuel and local police without revealing the watch's location. Richard's people had relied on isolated conversations, private threats, and undocumented fear for 28 years. Repeating that pattern would only strengthen them. Ethan finally agreed, although surrendering control felt more frightening than carrying the watch into an ambush. Samuel confirmed the church was empty except for pantry volunteers, then quietly moved everyone to the adjacent school before deputies surrounded the property from a distance. At 9:10, Ethan entered the sanctuary alone, with a replica watch Clara had assembled from photographs and workshop components, while Amara and Marcus watched through a concealed camera installed by local police. The church looked smaller than the version Samuel had described, its stone walls holding the cold dampness of a building that had survived floods, neglect, and other people's convenient memories. A man stepped from behind the altar, carrying Daniel's leather notebook, yet Daniel was nowhere in sight. Ethan recognized the intruder as Graham Pike, the security contractor seen entering the community center, who claimed Daniel remained alive at another location. Pike demanded the real watch and offered a trade: Daniel's address, the stolen wooden box, and permanent silence about Amara's family. When Ethan placed the replica on a pew, Pike examined the crown, discovered it lacked the hidden groove, and smiled as though Ethan had confirmed something more useful than possession. He said Richard had never known how the watch opened, which meant Ethan's attempt had finally revealed where the mechanism must be concealed. Police entered before Pike could escape, but he swallowed a small memory card and refused to name anyone who hired him. The wooden box was not in his vehicle, and the location he gave for Daniel led officers to an abandoned storage room containing only Daniel's coat and a recording of his voice. Ethan believed the rescue had failed until Amara noticed that Daniel repeated the phrase "fresh batteries" 3 times during the recording, words that sounded unnatural, until she remembered the cassette player Benjamin had once kept in the study. Daniel was signaling that he had hidden something inside a battery compartment before being taken. Back at the estate, investigators recovered a tiny key from the player, which opened a safe deposit box registered under Benjamin's former assistant. Inside, they found copies of letters Evelyn had sent after Pennsylvania, each stamped as received by Caldwell Capital, despite every envelope later being returned to her unopened. Someone within the company had intercepted them, copied them, and created false postal markings to convince Evelyn that Benjamin had rejected her. One letter contained the first complete explanation of 9/17. Evelyn wrote that Benjamin had stopped the watch when a telephone rang inside the church because the caller used a private Caldwell phrase known only to board members. Benjamin realized the person tracing him was not an outsider attempting robbery, but someone with access to family communications and company accounts. He placed preliminary evidence behind the watch casing, then gave the watch to Evelyn because she had no financial connection to the Caldwells and could not be discredited as a rival shareholder. Another letter described a second object, a strip of audio film hidden in the matching boxes, recording Richard admitting he redirected pension funds through shell companies to purchase controlling shares. The evidence would have destroyed him, but Benjamin hesitated because exposing the fraud immediately would also bankrupt hundreds of employees whose retirement accounts had been used without their knowledge. His silence had not been cowardice. It had been an attempt to recover the money before revealing the crime. The discovery complicated Ethan's judgment, because releasing incomplete records could trigger the same financial damage Benjamin had tried to prevent. Amara understood his fear, yet she challenged the assumption that truth and destruction were the only available choices. They could protect employees through an emergency fund, secure independent auditors, and disclose the evidence in stages, but only if Ethan stopped treating the company's reputation as more fragile than the people whose money had been stolen. Her words struck him, because Benjamin had made the same mistake from the opposite direction, protecting innocent workers while allowing Richard's silence to become institutional history. Ethan authorized Daniel's deputy to freeze transfers linked to the old shell companies and prepared a trust using his personal shares as temporary collateral. The decision could cost him control of Caldwell Capital, even if Richard were convicted, although for the first time, Ethan understood leadership as something larger than preserving his position. Near midnight, police traced Pike's disposable telephone to a private medical transport company owned through another layer of Richard's holdings. One vehicle had crossed the Hudson 2 hours earlier and entered a closed rehabilitation hospital in northern New Jersey, where Daniel was likely being held. Marcus recognized the company name from his own clinic statements, because the same corporation had recently purchased the rehabilitation network and denied coverage for his continued therapy. The connection revealed that Richard's fraud had never remained buried in old ledgers. It had evolved into modern businesses that profited by restricting care to people like Marcus. Amara no longer saw the mystery as her mother's unfinished promise, or Ethan's family shame. The same system that had forced Evelyn into silence now decided which patients recovered and which families became too exhausted to resist. As they prepared to leave for the hospital with police, Ethan received a live video call from Richard, who stood beside Daniel and held Evelyn's stolen box against his chest. Richard said he would exchange both at dawn, but only if Ethan signed away his voting shares before the board could learn why Benjamin had truly remained silent. Richard chose the abandoned rehabilitation hospital because its ownership structure placed the building behind 3 corporations and beyond the immediate authority of Caldwell Security, although state police obtained a warrant before dawn. Ethan agreed to the meeting while officers entered through a service tunnel identified by Marcus from an old architectural plan used across the clinic network. Amara refused to remain behind, arguing that Richard had spent decades assuming women without wealth could be frightened into surrendering what they protected. Ethan did not pretend he could guarantee her safety, which mattered more than another promise built from power, so they entered together carrying unsigned transfer documents and the real watch concealed beneath Amara's coat. Inside the hospital, empty therapy rooms stretched beneath failing fluorescent lights, their abandoned equipment revealing how easily profitable institutions discarded places once they stopped producing returns. Richard waited inside the hydrotherapy hall beside Daniel, whose wrists were bound but whose eyes remained alert. Evelyn's wooden box rested on a treatment table, damaged along one edge where someone had tried unsuccessfully to pry it open. Richard did not deny the fraud, because denial had become less useful than justification. He claimed Benjamin inherited a company too sentimental to survive, while Richard redirected dormant funds to acquire competitors, protect jobs, and build the empire Ethan later received without understanding its cost. The pension money had been returned within 5 years, he argued, and no employee ever knew enough to feel harmed. Benjamin's evidence threatened to collapse the company before the stolen funds could be replaced, which was why Richard intercepted Evelyn's letters and persuaded the family that Benjamin suffered a breakdown. He insisted Benjamin eventually accepted silence as the least destructive choice, then accused Ethan of exploiting old guilt to appear morally superior. Ethan almost believed the argument's shape, because the company had indeed grown during those years, yet Marcus asked the question Richard had avoided. If no one had been harmed, why had the clinic network recently denied treatment while transferring millions into executive bonuses controlled by the same shell companies? Richard's composure fractured for the first time, not from shame, but from irritation that someone he considered irrelevant had followed the money into the present. He admitted the medical network generated the cash required to maintain control after Ethan began reforming Caldwell governance, then dismissed therapy denials as actuarial decisions made by people who understood business. Amara quietly activated the recorder inside Marcus's telephone, although Richard noticed the movement and ordered Pike's remaining associate to take it. Daniel used the distraction to drive his chair into the man's knees, while officers entered through the service doors and ended the confrontation without gunfire. Richard attempted to destroy Evelyn's box by striking it against the tiled floor, but Amara caught it against her body, protecting the damaged wood, while Ethan restrained Richard until police secured his hands. The moment contained no triumph, only the exhausted silence of people realizing how much suffering one man had justified by renaming greed as stability. At the station, Richard's attorney argued that the hospital confession could be challenged because parts were recorded before officers announced their presence. The older evidence still mattered, but without the second box, they lacked the complete audio film Thomas Vale had designed to preserve. Daniel, bruised but conscious, explained that the missing desk drawer was not stolen for its contents. It had been taken because the drawer itself formed Benjamin's half of the mechanism. Police recovered it from Pike's warehouse, along with documents linking Richard to the threats, although the carved oak box inside remained sealed. Clara arrived from Bellwether and aligned Evelyn's damaged box with Benjamin's, placing the brass key from the cassette player through the matching circular marks beneath their bases. The two boxes opened inward like mirrored books, revealing a narrow spool of photographic sound film, several original pension ledgers, and one final envelope addressed jointly to Ethan and Evelyn. Benjamin's letter admitted that he had allowed fear to become a form of betrayal. He had intended to protect employees, yet every month of silence gave Richard more control and left Evelyn carrying danger she never chose. Benjamin wrote that he loved her, although he refused to turn that love into an excuse for abandoning his obligations as a husband, father, or employer. Their bond had not been an affair, but the intimacy of two people who recognized courage in each other during one terrifying night. He asked Evelyn to keep the evidence only until he created a lawful recovery plan, then failed to contact her after Richard threatened to expose fabricated claims that would destroy the church and discredit her nursing license. Benjamin spent years quietly restoring the pension accounts and building safeguards against another theft, yet shame prevented him from telling Ethan why integrity sometimes required public accountability rather than private repair. The final paragraph asked Ethan not to inherit his silence merely because he had inherited everything else. The sound film contained Richard's younger voice, directing an accountant to transfer pension money and instructing him to label Benjamin emotionally unstable if he resisted. More importantly, the recording captured Benjamin refusing to participate and warning that Evelyn possessed enough evidence to expose them. The proof established Richard's motive for every later action, while modern financial records tied the same shell network to the rehabilitation company and several fraudulent insurance denials. Ethan convened the board under independent legal supervision and presented a disclosure plan protecting employees, patients, and shareholders before releasing the evidence publicly. He placed his voting shares into a temporary trust, funded Marcus's clinic network through restitution rather than charity, and requested that the board suspend him until regulators completed their review. Several directors urged him to remain, but Ethan understood that accountability lost meaning when leaders exempted themselves from its inconvenience. Hours before the public meeting, Amara stood with Ethan on the estate balcony and asked whether he feared losing the company. He admitted that he feared discovering the company had only loved him while he could protect its version of history. Amara told him institutions did not love people, although people inside them sometimes chose loyalty, courage, or comfort. The lesson was deciding which one deserved to survive. Ethan looked at the watch, now running again, after Clara repaired its mechanism, and noticed the minute hand approaching 9:17. For 28 years, that time had represented the moment Benjamin became afraid. Tomorrow, it would mark the moment his son decided whether truth could become something other than another family performance. The public meeting began at 9:17, inside the Caldwell Auditorium, not because Ethan wanted symbolism, but because regulators, employees, patients, and shareholders deserved to hear the truth before markets opened. He stepped onto the stage without the silver watch, leaving it with Amara in the front row, because the object belonged to the person who had protected it, rather than the man whose name appeared on its case. Ethan described the pension theft, the intercepted letters, the false narrative surrounding Benjamin, and the modern rehabilitation network that continued extracting profit from vulnerable families. He did not present his father as a flawless victim, because Benjamin's courage during the fraud had been weakened by years of secrecy afterward. Protecting employees from immediate collapse had been honorable. Denying them the right to understand what endangered their future had not. Ethan accepted responsibility for leading an institution built partly upon that silence, even though he had not created the crime, and could have defended himself by claiming ignorance. Richard's attorney attempted to interrupt the presentation, but independent counsel introduced the restored recordings, original ledgers, contractor payments, hospital confession, and records showing current insurance denials tied to executive bonus transfers. Employees listened to Benjamin's voice refuse the scheme, then heard him confess that private repair could never replace public truth. The evidence produced no theatrical outburst, because betrayal often becomes most powerful when a room grows quiet enough for everyone to recognize what they once accepted. Several longtime directors resigned before the meeting ended, while others voted to establish a restitution fund using recovered assets, executive compensation, and part of Ethan's personal holdings. The board also transferred temporary leadership to an outside restructuring officer, preserving Caldwell capital without pretending continuity mattered more than reform. Ethan walked away from the position he had spent half his life preparing to hold, yet the loss felt cleaner than the security Richard had offered in exchange for silence. Outside the auditorium, reporters surrounded Amara and asked whether she and Ethan were romantically involved, whether Evelyn had manipulated Benjamin, and whether Marcus's treatment would now be financed by Caldwell money. Amara refused the story they wanted and gave them the one that mattered. Her mother had protected evidence because a frightened man trusted her character, but Evelyn had paid for that trust through years of surveillance, unanswered letters, and uncertainty. Marcus would receive therapy because stolen funds were being restored to patients, not because a billionaire had rescued him. She asked the public to remember that corruption rarely survives through one powerful villain alone. It survives because ordinary institutions make exhausted people prove their suffering repeatedly, while influential people are believed without evidence. The statement spread farther than the gala photographs ever had, turning Evelyn from a mysterious woman beside Benjamin into the moral center of the investigation. Richard was charged with financial fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, evidence tampering, and obstruction, while several former executives negotiated cooperation agreements. The legal process took months rather than ending with a single dramatic confession, and Ethan attended every hearing without using private entrances. Some investors blamed him for the company's temporary decline, although employees whose pensions were protected began sending letters that complicated the public narrative. They did not praise Benjamin's silence, but many understood the fear behind it, because they had also postponed difficult truths while trying to protect their families. Ethan read those letters beside Amara at the Brooks apartment, where Marcus continued therapy and gradually regained enough strength to walk short distances with forearm crutches. Progress remained slow, painful, and expensive, yet it no longer depended upon Amara accepting invisible sacrifices as the price of being responsible. The Caldwell estate converted Benjamin's private study into an independent archive, documenting the fraud, the recovery plan, and Evelyn's role, with every exhibit reviewed by historians from outside the family. Amara refused a ceremonial title, although she accepted leadership of a new patient advocacy council only after confirming that its budget and authority could not be withdrawn by future executives. She insisted that every denial of essential rehabilitation receive human review, plain language explanation, and an appeal process that did not punish families for lacking lawyers. Marcus joined the council after completing an accessibility certification course, using the experience he once considered an interruption to design better systems for others. Daniel returned to work under the restructuring officer, although he began teaching younger employees that loyalty to a leader never excused silence about harm. The reforms did not erase what happened, but they transformed memory from a polished family possession into a public responsibility. Ethan spent nearly a year outside executive leadership, advising small businesses, attending governance hearings, and learning how much of his identity had depended upon being introduced before he entered a room. His friendship with Amara deepened slowly, without grand gifts or public declarations, because both understood that gratitude could easily imitate love when two people survived the same crisis. They argued about policy, laughed over Marcus's terrible coffee, and traveled to Bellwether to help Samuel restore the church roof, with funds recovered through the legal settlement. One evening beneath the stone arch where Evelyn had once stood beside Benjamin, Ethan admitted that he did not know whether he had become a better man or merely a man who finally lost the ability to avoid becoming one. Amara answered that character was rarely a permanent achievement. It was the choice people repeated when no audience remained. The board eventually invited Ethan to return as chief executive under strict governance reforms, and he accepted only after employees, patient representatives, and independent directors received permanent voting seats. He did not frame the return as redemption because redemption belonged to people who continued repairing harm after the headlines faded. On the anniversary of the Hawthorne Gala, Ethan attended the same charity event without entering through the private reception line. Amara arrived beside Marcus, who crossed the ballroom with a cane and refused assistance until the final polished step. When the orchestra began, Ethan handed Amara the restored watch, its hands moving beyond 9:17 for the first time in decades. She opened the back and found no hidden evidence, only a new engraving placed beneath Benjamin's faded initials. Truth is not what we inherit, it is what we choose to carry. Amara closed the watch and returned it to Ethan, explaining that her mother had completed the promise long before either of them understood its cost. The object no longer needed protection because the truth had been distributed among people who could challenge any future attempt to bury it. Ethan asked her to dance, not beneath the attention of photographers, but near the edge of the ballroom, where servers moved through the crowd and noticed what powerful guests often missed. Amara accepted, then smiled when Ethan glanced toward a young waiter, nearly struck by a careless donor, and stepped aside to steady his tray. The moment was small, unrecorded, and invisible to everyone who believed transformation required an audience. Amara saw it clearly, and Ethan understood that the most important judgment of his life had never come from a board, a courtroom, or a family name. It came from becoming the kind of man who acted differently when no one important appeared to be watching.